Hey babes, welcome back to It's Only Embarrassing If You're Embarrassed podcast. My name is Madison, and thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of Mental Health Monday. If you guys are new here, Mental Health Monday is an episode that I do every Monday where we unpack something in the world of mental health and I share a little bit about what I've learned, how it's impacted my journey, and of course, some tips and tricks as to how I've learned to navigate some of those mental health challenges. So, today we are going to be talking about something that I think is very not normalized in the world of mental health, and that is depression. And I think part of the reason that depression is not very normalized in the world of mental health is because I think it has maybe like a negative or sad connotation. And then I also think that a lot of people don't really know about depression or understand depression. So, this episode, I'm going to share with you guys a little bit about my journey with depression, how it's impacted me, my story, and some tips, tricks, and resources that I've learned along the way. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little Pinterest quote about what depression is. So, obviously, maybe you don't know this. If you don't know this, majority of mental illnesses are a chemical imbalance in the brain. And so that means generally your brain is missing serotonin or dopamine or just something different like that, where your brain is not able to fight off the anxiety or the depression because it's missing something in your brain. So that kind of at its core is what obviously mental illness is just that chemical imbalance. So it doesn't mean anything's wrong with you. It just means there's something that maybe doesn't exist in your brain, and it's just like any other kind of medical condition where maybe you have to take a medication because otherwise your kidneys won't work. Some of us got to take it, otherwise our brains don't work in a good way, and that's a little bit about kind of how mental health meds work. Excuse me. All right, so what is depression? So I found this Pinterest quote that says, depression is living in a body that fights to survive with a mind that tries to die. So I think that's kind of a good way to kind of describe what it's like whenever you're in like a depressive state or episode, because your body is like doing all the things to try to make your mind better. You're going to the gym, you're meditating, you're reading, you're doing, all the things to try to fight off depression. And your mind's literally just like, nope, not good enough. Nope, not gonna work. Nope, not gonna make us happy. And so I thought that was a really interesting way to just kind of encompass what depression is, because it's literally like your mind fighting against your body. Another thing that I wrote down about depression is I think a lot of people who have depression overcompensate it with humor. And so then whenever they share that they're depressed, people are like, what, you? And so I definitely know that's something that's resonated with me a lot, is that whenever I was really depressed, I really I struggled to share that with other people. And whenever I did, I generally tried to bring it up as like some sort of like funny joke, not necessarily like being vulnerable and honest about how I was struggling. And I think that's pretty common, really, is like, I think I don't know if you guys have seen those like memes or videos that are like, I love your sense of humor. And they're like, thanks, it's the trauma. And so I think a lot of people who have had like struggles with mental health, they try to overcompensate that with humor. And so then it's like almost like a little bit more shocking when they're like, oh, and I'm depressed. And you're like, really? And so I think that's something that I kind of struggled with in the realm of just dealing with mental health challenges and specifically depression. So, how does depression manifest? Depression generally manifests from genetic and environmental factors. So, obviously, some of us have a predisposition to mental illness because maybe we have a family history of mental illness, a family history of depression, anxiety, whatever that looks like. And so, a lot of times, depression is kind of like any other like health thing that's passed down. Depression or other mental illnesses can kind of be passed down from generation to generation. There's also environmental factors that can cause depression. So I ended up in a really bad depression after my dad died, and then I ended up in a really bad depression again after I went through a really messy divorce, and I lost a lot of friends, and my life just changed super drastically, and maybe not in a super positive way. And it was really challenging for me. And so when I found that whenever I go through like major life changes that really like drastically impact my life, I am more prone to sink back into that depressive state. And that is also something that I think is interesting about mental illness, is that it's different for everybody. And so you kind of have to figure out and learn your body, how it manifests for you, how it shows up for you, what things trigger it, and then also what things that you can use to combat it. Okay, so a couple other ways that depression manifests. I wrote down anger, lashing out, being very overly self critical, trying to control yourself or others. And then another thing that I wrote down, which was super like prominent on my journey with depression, is avoidance or numbing through alcohol, drugs, travel, food, sex, literally whatever. The ability to like escape depression almost for just for a little while, even if it's not through a good channel, is definitely something that I struggled with, definitely specifically with my journey with drinking. I would say whenever I got really depressed, that's when my drinking problem definitely got to probably the worst that it's ever been. And now that I have a really good psychiatrist, she has kind of educated me on the fact that a lot of times, actually pretty much every time that somebody has a issue with drinking or drugs, it's generally because they're trying to self-medicate through medication that they need for their mental health that they don't have. And so, for example, alcohol is something that gives a lot of dopamine to your brain. Dopamine, obviously, is what your brain needs to fight off depression. So there's a lot of things that people use or get addicted to instead of getting or having the right mental health medications. And that was certainly the case in my situation. So, how does it impact you in your life? And so, I think this is interesting because I think there's probably people watching this that are like, okay, I don't have depression, but I know other people that have depression. And then I see like these weird things manifest in them, and like, what is that all about? So, some ways that it impacted me was not wanting to like respond or interact, like very uninterested in like relationships, friendships, things like that. Also, I think definitely a negative worldview and kind of like a victim mentality. Like, oh, of course something else bad is happening to me. Like, oh, things always bad happen to me. Like, just kind of that getting stuck in that like depressive, negative mindset spiral loop where you just like think like the world happens to you, not for you. And that definitely, I think, can be a way that depression kind of comes out. Ooh, messy and unorganized is another one. Like if you come over to my house and everything's organized and has its place, like my mental health's in a good state. If you come over and everything is chaos, probably not doing super great. Another way that it impacts is you don't necessarily have like excitement for future. You may want to isolate because you're more comfortable being alone than with others. Just all sorts of things like that, as far as kind of ways that depression really manifests in the way that you kind of navigate life in those stages. So, whenever I got on antidepressants the first time, it was probably in the year that my dad died and I got a divorce and my ex tried to ruin my life and I lost my dog and like all these things. And essentially like my brain just like it was like went into shock of like, holy shit, I cannot believe so many bad things happened in such a small amount of time. I literally can't deal with this. And so I needed head meds to reset. And so I have taken medicine for anxiety and depression, and that's something that has hugely helped me in my journey. And I think it helps really a lot of people, especially if they are missing serotonin or dopamine. And so, one thing about dopamine is whenever I was drinking every day, I was giving my brain this rush of dopamine. And then whenever I stopped drinking, my brain was like, what the heck, we still need that dopamine. And so then after I stopped drinking, I got really depressed again, and I actually got put back on antidepressants when I stopped drinking, probably like 2 weeks in. And fortunately, I've come off them now, and so I've like obviously adjusted to the lifestyle of not drinking, but definitely can impact you in terms of things like that, because essentially what I was doing was treating my anxiety and depression with alcohol every day, and then one day I just took that away and my brain was like, ah. So alrighty, so some tips for if you are struggling with depression, if somebody reaches out and says they're struggling with depression. So, a big thing that I think is always super helpful is therapy. So, I personally go to CBT therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, And that has helped me a lot because it essentially helps you to reprogram your brain, your mindset, your thinking spirals, and really be able to help with that challenge and with that journey. Another thing that I think is super helpful for depression is to do a gratitude journal. So, whenever I was really struggling with depression, I had a therapist that recommended doing a gratitude journal, just trying to write down 3 things that I was thankful for. And there would be some days that I would literally be like, I am not gonna be able to come up with anything. And then I would sit down to do it. And then all of a sudden I would be able to come up with things that I was grateful for. And obviously gratitude fights off both anxiety and depression. So that I think is something that's super easy, quick, and something really that anybody can do to help combat anxiety and depression. Another thing that really helped me, as I mentioned, was head meds. So, taking medicine for anxiety and depression over the past couple of years has really, really helped to reset my brain, my mind, and to give my brain the serotonin and dopamine that it needed. So, the Pinterest quote that I wanted to close on about depression that I stumbled upon, it says, sleep isn't just sleep anymore, it's an escape. And so I think that was super real for me whenever I was really depressed because it was almost like nothing while I was awake could ever fulfill me, make me happy, satisfy me. And so then it's like whenever you're sleeping, at least you don't have to deal with that. And that's kind of a sad reality, I think, of sometimes how it is whenever you're super depressed. And so I wanted to kind of share that quote because I think that one, I wanted to normalize that sometimes that is the reality of depression, how it impacts people and what it looks like. And I also wanted you to know that if you're watching this and you are struggling with depression, you are not alone. A lot of other people in the world are, and figure out what works for you as far as how you can deal with, cope with, and manage depression. So, if you are depressed, do not be ashamed to get help, to get medication, to tell people, to reach out and say that you need support. You would be shocked how often people are going to be significantly more kind and supportive than you would have expected. And I think one thing about my journey with depression is I had a level of probably shame and judgment towards myself for that. So I assumed that other people would have that of me if I told them that I was depressed. And so I was kind of projecting a level of shame onto my expectation of what I thought people would think about me. And they weren't actually thinking that just because it's something that I was insecure about. And so I think that's very common with depression and really any mental illness is just kind of being afraid to tell people or what will they think or say or all those sorts of things. And so I just want to try to take away some of that maybe fear and stigmatization around mental health. My last little tip is another little freebie tip. Pinterest has lots of ideas, education, help tips, all those sorts of things on anxiety and depression, a lot about depression specifically, ideas for how to cope, what it is, things to educate yourself, and a little bit of everything in between. So I hope that that gives you guys some ideas, some tips and tricks, and a little bit of normalization around depression and around just the struggles of mental health. So thank you guys for tuning in to this episode of It's Only Embarrassing If You're Embarrassed podcast. My name's Madison. If you guys like this episode, please and then if you guys have anybody that you think this episode would benefit from, please share it with them. And if you guys have any tips or tricks about things that you have done to combat depression, please leave them in the comments below. Would love to start a little comment chain just talking about different things that people do to combat depression and how we can share and make a little community of positive, just mental health ideas and normalization. Thank you guys for tuning into this episode of It's Only Embarrassing If You're Embarrassed podcast. I'll see you guys on Wednesday for the next episode. Happy healing day.